and thank you for tuning in to ILTV's Israel Weekly, where we discuss the latest in Israel's geopolitical developments. I'm Aaron Porras, and with me today in the studio are former head of Israeli Air Force Intelligence, Brigadier General Ram Shmueli, and former Israeli Ambassador to South Africa, Ilan Baruch. Thank you both of you for joining me today. Now, today our main topic will be the strengthening of the internationally recognized terror group Hamas on what seems to be all of our borders. But first, the precedent-setting trip to Latin America by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife Sarah. So the Netanyahus have flown to Latin America, touching down first in Argentina for the beginning of a series of meetings across several countries. Netanyahu will be the first sitting prime minister to take a trip like this with this itinerary, which signals the likely building of key friendships that until today were rocky at best.
We're going to start visit to Latin America, beginning with Buenos Aires. I'm going from here to two memorial services. One for the Israeli embassy that was blown up here, and second for the Jewish Community Center that was also blown up here, both by Iranian and Hezbollah terror. We share the pain, we know the pain, we felt it.
Now, I'm going to start off the discussion with you, Ambassador Baruch. You know, they talk about this wonderful procession of welcoming Prime Minister Netanyahu and his wife into the country of Argentina, but they didn't really cover fully, you know, all the protesters arguing to charge Netanyahu with war crimes and things like that. Do you think that there is still a heavy anti-Israel sentiment in Argentina that we have to contend with, or is that just like a minority?
Well, Latin America is debating its relationship with Israel since day one. It's interesting to note that on that very day, 29th of November 47, when the secession of the British mandate in Palestine was discussed and the creation of two states, one Arab, one Jewish, the Latin American bloc was very heavy. 20 out of 56 members of the UN at the time. Wow. Today we have 193. 56 states, 55 participated, only Thailand was absent. Mm-hmm. And of the 20 states, one was voted against the petition and the creation of the State of Israel, Cuba, and 13 voted in favor. There were 3 countries out of 6 that were abstained: Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico. And these are the countries Netanyahu chose to visit this time.
So, I mean,
on his way to celebrated a UN General Assembly 70 years after the vote for partition. And I think this is the main issue for Netanyahu beyond the business and the bilateral relations with Argentina.
Okay, and moving into something a little bit more, you know, intelligence related, is opening up ties with these countries strategically important, or is it more, you know, to get some aid in international forums and to close the chapter on some ugly history?
I think that diplomacy and, of course, Jewish interests in South America are the leading agenda. Nevertheless, about intelligence, if you ask about intelligence, today the world is so well network, and actually, when you're talking about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, those are network organizations. Those are not hierarchy organizations. So in case, if you want to confront such organizations like this, you have to build a net against a net. So today, the intelligence agencies all over the world are forced to cooperate much more than we have done in the past. But still, I think that this visit is not about intelligence sharing, even though it's happened.
So I mean, one of, you know, the first country that he's in, Argentina, he mentioned the 2 bombings perpetrated by Iran and Hezbollah agents. Are we still going to have some pushback by Iran? Do you think that maybe they still have a presence in Latin America that we should be worried about?
So Iran is operating and behaving like a kind of a local, regional superpower, and have some roots and branches all over the world, according to support war terrorism. So it won't be a surprise, and I know I just want to to remind us that Hezbollah and Iran always said that they owe us on Murnia and other places. They are going to find the time and the way to retaliate. So it can be in South America, even like it have been in those two attacks back in how many years?
94.
94.
Oh, no, 93. I want to second the Ram's observation. You know, the two attacks in Latin America, they were perpetrated by organizations that were dormant, affiliated with Hezbollah, and were dormant in the continent, and they were activated in response to an Israeli attack on the predecessor of the current leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah. A helicopter was used to intercept a car with, I forgot his name, but his entire family was killed. So yes, we hear about terrorism, but we need to know the context.
I see. Now, if we move on a little bit forward in the same vein to Netanyahu's UN General Assembly speech, which you mentioned earlier, you know, of course, I think it's understandable that he's going to bring up Iran and the challenges that Israel is facing in the region with Iran's growing power, and we'll get more into that later. But, you know, what do you think his assertions will fall on deaf ears at the UN?
I think that Netanyahu is a shrewd chess player, and his objective is none of what was stated so far, but he is trying continuously to deal with the Green Line. He was attempting to gain international recognition of the situation Israel is in currently, to defeat the whole principle of Green Line as the separation line between future Palestine and Israel. He's been doing so on the Golan. Was trying to gain international acceptance of Israeli domination of the Golan beyond the Green Line, unsuccessfully. And last year, really a day before Christmas and the very last days of the Obama administration, the UN, very much with the support of Obama, even though the Americans abstained, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2334, which is re-emphasizing, reasserting the Green Line as a line beyond of which it's occupied territory, even in Jerusalem. And I think it is interesting for our listeners and viewers to realize that the Americans refused a request by Netanyahu to join the president on his visit to the Kotel, because the Americans do not recognize the Kotel as part of Israel. It is beyond the Green Line. So until after we get an agreement with the Palestinians, that is the main objective of Netanyahu, to defeat the Green Line. And he's doing so in Latin America and in the UN.
I must agree that maybe this is his agenda, but I disagree, of course, about talking about the Golan Heights annexation as a mistake. I think it was an amazing decision, and nowadays we see how smart it was back in, I think, Begin times, that he decided upon. And the same things go to many places in the territory. So I disagree with the ambassador about, I agree with him that maybe this is his agenda, but
The American agenda.
The American agenda,
or Netanyahu's
agenda, but I think that the Green Line is not relevant anymore. And if Netanyahu is trying to convince and describe the situation on the ground and try to find a solution for the future, not talking about, I think it's a very important step. Nevertheless, I think that he got those agendas about Iran. You want me to elaborate about it now? So if we are talking about Trump administration in the region, they are very supportive and a lot of visits and everything, free connections, but the ones that rules the Middle East is Putin. And when Netanyahu he was smart enough to build this kind of connection between the Russian leader Putin and himself, so he can go there and draw some red lines, and Israel got now some red lines, and those red lines will fall on open ears, I think, after what's happened in North Korea. Now when Netanyahu is talking, first of all, he's talking about Iran getting some infrastructure in Syria, and this is a red line from Israel. This is not smuggling weapon to Lebanon. This is building infrastructure. But secondly, about Iran nuclear capabilities, when the world can't confront North Korea, and now when Netanyahu is going to speak about the capability and the agreement, the not good agreement for the world with Iran, I think it will fall on open ears. Nevertheless, interests are interests, and maybe the countries will behave according to their interests.
Well, I hope you're right, because they're just recently, as you mentioned, the United Nations Security Council unanimously passed a resolution to add sanctions on North Korea for their nuclear program. But at the same time, according to the United Nations, Iran is perfectly adhering to the JCPOA and the Iranian nuclear agreement. So it's difficult, at least from my perspective, to see that the United Nations is looking at the agreement with Iran in the same way that they're looking at the previous agreement with North Korea. But going back a little bit to Trump, because you started talking about American interests versus Russian, if Netanyahu was supposed to meet with Trump as well, which he is in New York, what then is the new administration's goal? Because you said during the Obama administration they were against the Green Line, but now maybe his ideals have changed, but not much has happened since then. So maybe if you'd like to discuss a little bit about that. Yeah, please.
I want to back Ram's observation again about Iran with one slight difference. Iran and North Korea are very different to each other. First of all, North Korea opted to leave the NPT, non-proliferation treaty, and Iran took upon itself all the obligations of the NPT, more than many other countries. And there is a very intrusive inspection in Iran, and it is, so far, it is honoring its agreement with 5+1 to the dot. So there's a lot of politics involved, internal American politics, and Trump is very frustrated with his inability to implement any of his promises during his campaign. And now he's making noises about him and Nikki Haley, his envoy to the UN. But I'm afraid we will all be disappointed, so to speak, and America will reaffirm its commitment in the next round in October.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we have to move on to the next subject. Hamas, the internationally recognized terror organization, and elected rulers of the Gaza Strip have been very busy lately. According to reports from Nadav Argaman, the head of the Israeli Shin Bet security services, despite being spread quite thin and in the midst of a humanitarian crisis, Hamas is gearing up for war, and they've already spread into Lebanon with the backing of Iran. Perhaps in preparation for said war, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was just recently in Cairo trying to reopen borders and ease tensions on the Strip.
وفد حركة حماس برئاسة الأخ إسماعيل هنية من الداخل والخارج سوف يبحث مع المسؤولين المصريين قضايا مهمة على رأسها سبل تعزيز العلاقات الثنائية مع مصر الشقيقة، وأيضا متابعة التفاهمات المصرية الفلسطينية مع حركة حماس بما يخص قطاع غزة وتخفيف الحصار وتخفيف معاناة أهلنا في القطاع. أيضا سوف يتطرق الوفد إلى قضايا وطنية فلسطينية على رأسها سبل تعزيز المصالحة الوطنية الفلسطينية وإنهاء انقسام وتوحيد الصف الداخلي الفلسطيني.
So for my first question, I'd like to know, first, it doesn't sound like he was talking about war. It sounded like he was talking about some very positive things, reconnecting and strengthening their enclave. So do we trust him at his word, or do we just say, he's just a spokesman? I'm going to start with you.
So some basic facts. Hamas is dealing very intensively in the last 3 years after the war. 3 channels. First of all, to make the rockets better, stronger, and more accurate, and that they got some help from Hezbollah and other places from the world. Secondly, they develop a UAV kind of squadron, so capabilities of small airplanes so they control it. And third is the tunnels. They improve their tunnels, even though since Israel is very operating on the border about the tunnels, so they try to do tunnels that maybe will stop on the border, and then it will be kind of power projection for the future. So this is about capabilities. Now you ask me about, not capabilities, about the intentions.
Yeah.
And this is controlled by 3 channels. And this is power supply, materials, basically to build things, cement and other things, and of course food. Food is include water. And those 3 channels go directly through Hamas. 30% of all of those supplies go to Hamas people, Hamas infrastructure, Hamas activities to build the tunnels and other things. So it's up to them, and today they control the strip very well because they control all of those 3 channels. So from the outside world, this is Fatah and Israel with the power supply, and Egypt, they want to buy what's happened from Egypt. But don't be worried. When I was Google to prepare to this interview, I saw some headlines about breakthrough between the relationship between Egypt and Hamas. And I saw it was 2012, 2014, and now it's 2017. Those are very hard enemies, Egypt and Hamas. Nevertheless, Egypt is a key player to ease the tension on the Strip. So if they're going to do it, I think if the shortage of food and supply will be so devastating to the population, Hamas will not ease their 30%. They will force to go to war. They are deterred by Israel, but nevertheless, if the population...
So you think that they're in a similar situation, honestly, to North Korea, where they have to go to war? You know, everything is riding on a war at this point.
2 different scales.
2 different scales, of course, but principally, it's very similar.
So you can't anticipate, but you can control the measures. They are deterred by Israel, and they don't want a war for the time being.
So, I mean, but then what are the pros and cons, I'll go to you, Ambassador, for Hamas and Egypt to actually rejoin? Because on the one hand, you're saying that if the humanitarian crisis continues, they'll be forced into a war. So maybe by easing the humanitarian crisis, it will avoid one.
Well, I think we need to look one step ahead, because the level of mutual deterrence between Israel and Hamas is, in a way, cooling the appetite for a military conflict on both sides.
Okay.
The problem of Israel is that compared to Hamas, it is so developed and so sensitive to any interference with its infrastructure. If Hamas is getting rocket capacity that is more accurate than before, the ability to silence Ben Gurion Airport becomes more effective. And Israel cannot afford stopping because it has an impact on the entire economy and infrastructure. So both are sort of mutually deterring each other. And Hamas, its problem is not on the battlefield, but in the international theater of action. And it is trying now for quite some time to gain some entry into, and that means going through the barrier of being labeled as a terrorist organization. That's a long fight, but they are trying to gain a partnership with Egypt on that, and at the expense of partnership with Turkey and Qatar, with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with others. And I think that we will have, we will see more and more of this kind of operation. namely no conflict on the battlefield, a conflict in the domain of diplomacy.
I see. All right, well, going back to Lebanon then, what do you make of that? What do you make of Lebanon and Hezbollah and Iran and Hamas?
I think this is a kind of a professional or their hunger to support technology and of course money, but mainly capabilities. So this is not like the channel that Ilan described, which I agree. This is in the international arena. This is the knowledge and the capabilities of rockets and UAVs and tunnels belong to those guys in the north and Iran. So this is kind of contradictions. It's contradict the notions that Ilan described, that they want to get rid of the label of terrorist organization. But if you deal with Hezbollah and Iran, which support terrorism, so it's contradict. But they need it. They need it because otherwise they can't even keep the deterrence equation that Ilan described.
What about keeping their own character? Because you spoke earlier of Hamas spreading itself thin and having already been spread thin. So if they're continuing to take out handouts and help and assistance from other organizations in other countries, at what point do those countries and those organizations input overrule Hamas's identity?
But in the Middle East, just to remind you, Hezbollah and Iran are Shia, and Hamas is Sunni. And in the Middle East, there is a kind of a big two fronts, the Shia and the Sunni. And Hamas is the only one that jangle between all of those, just from the point of view of interest. And I think that they are playing a wrong play in that regard, because they're going to lose from everywhere. And the Egyptian, as I said, those are bad enemies, those two partners. So the Egyptians are threatened by Hamas because they are partner of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the underground in Egypt now. So in that regard, Hamas, and if you can ask, okay, so why don't they go with the Fatah and Palestinian Authority? It's reasonable. Let's unite together. Which
Hamas has recently said that they're willing to try.
Yeah, but it won't happen. It won't happen because their interests. They are fighting on votes on the Judea and Samaria. They're fighting on votes there, and they have different. But I don't care about them, but I care about us, and I just want to elaborate one more thing. I think if we have to think strategically, although I analyze the situation, what will be here and there, this is tactic. Strategically, we have to find a solution to give them hope. Those people do not have hope. And those people are jeopardized by the destiny in this kind of a jail. And this is not our force, because this is their leaders, but we have to help the world to change this equation.
All right, well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. Now, to finish our show, I'd like to end on a positive note. So let's get some final thoughts. Our silver lining. I'm actually going to go back to you, Brigadier General. Just give us the positive way to end after a kind of a stressful conversation of what will happen next.
As always, I'm very optimistic. I think that deterrence and strong hand on one side and giving hope to the people with many bilateral, regional kind of deals about water, about food, about technology. This will stop the next war much better than kind of a deterrence equation, which is important, which is essential. But for the future, you have to build a future for those people.
I support Ram's observation, only that I wouldn't go for technology and improvement of the life level of income and so on, but give them statehood, give them dignity, give them liberty, and we will have a different Middle East.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. So, all right, that is unfortunately all the time that we have today for this edition of ILTV's Israel Weekly. Again, I'd like to thank our guests, Ambassador Baruch and Brigadier General Shmueli, for coming in. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. See you next week, and shalom from Israel.
Shana tova.
Shana tova. the